In medieval times, warmth wasn't something people could easily get. For the upper class, turning their homes into cozy places took clever thinking and smart use of what they had. Despite the freezing cold outside, they made sure that their homes stayed warm, wrapping them in a constant embrace of coziness. And speaking of creativity, you won't believe the lengths these nobles went to. Their most impressive weapon against the cold was something we totally take for granted today: the fireplace. But hold on, these weren't your cozy modern fireplaces where you press a button and voila! These were massive, hungry beasts that devoured wood like teenagers raid a fridge. I'm not even exaggerating. Some households went through more than 150 logs per week. That's enough wood to build a small cabin, just to keep warm for 7 days. The centerpiece of any noble's castle wasn't some fancy throne or a portrait of serious-looking ancestors. It was these enormous fireplaces. Poor servants would trek through forests gathering wood like their lives depended on it, which, honestly, they kind of did. Getting creative with staying warm meant keeping these fire-breathing monsters well-fed at all times. Now, you might think having a fireplace meant living in tropical paradise, right? Wrong. Even with these roaring fires, castles were still cold enough to store ice cream if they had invented it yet. The heat from these fireplaces was like that one friend who refuses to share their snacks. It stayed pretty close to the source. This meant that medieval nobles basically played a never-ending game of musical chairs, except instead of music stopping, they were chasing warmth. But here's where their clever thinking really shone. They figured out that smoke shouldn't just hang around like an unwanted guest. That's why the invention of chimneys was such a big deal. Finally, you could breathe and be warmish at the same time. Revolutionary. Talk about getting creative with what you've got. The really wealthy folks got even smarter. They created what I like to call heat highways through their castles by installing multiple fireplaces. Important rooms would be near these heat sources, while the less crucial areas, well, let's just say if you were a medieval noble and someone suggested meeting in the North Tower in January, they probably weren't your friend. This strategic placement of fireplaces was their version of modern multi-zone heating, except instead of pressing buttons on a thermostat, you had to convince several servants to keep hauling wood up several flights of stairs. And the best part, these fireplaces weren't just about heating, they became the medieval version of social media, where all the hot gossip happened. Everyone would gather around them, sharing stories, probably complaining about the weather, some things never change, and finding creative ways to pretend they weren't freezing their noble behinds while enjoying that constant embrace of coziness they worked so hard to maintain. While fireplaces kept the common areas toasty, bedtime brought its own chilly challenges. Medieval nobles weren't about to let a little thing like freezing temperatures ruin their beauty sleep. Their bedchambers were like the world's first luxury sleep spas, minus the cucumbers on the eyes, and plus a whole lot of feathers. Let me tell you about these beds. We're talking serious cloud-like comfort here. The wealthy stuffed their mattresses with the finest down feathers money could buy. A noble's bed could contain feathers from over 100 birds. No wonder they slept until noon. I'd never want to leave that fluffy nest either. The real genius came in layers. First, there was the wool sleepwear, because nothing says sweet dreams like wearing a sheep. Then came the blankets. Not one, not two, but sometimes up to 7 layers of heavy wool quilts. By the time they were done piling them on, getting into bed was probably the day's workout. But here's my favorite part, the bed warmer. Before tucking in for the night, servants would take these metal pans filled with hot coals and slide them between the sheets like a medieval hot water bottle. Just don't roll over too quickly, or you might get more than just a warm bed. One wrong move and suddenly you're doing the medieval version of the floor is lava. The piece de resistance was the 4-poster bed with its heavy curtains. These weren't just for show or privacy. They were basically medieval sleeping bags. Once those curtains were drawn, you had your own little cocoon of warmth. Plus, they were excellent at muffling the sound of teeth chattering. And don't get me started on the carpets. These weren't your standard IKEA rugs. They were serious investments in foot comfort. Because let's face it, nothing ruins a cozy morning faster than putting your feet on a stone floor that feels like it's been storing ice since last winter. The wealthy would import exotic carpets from far-off lands, creating what might be the first ever heated floor system. Now, medieval nobles had some rather unconventional roommates when it came to staying warm. Cats weren't just adorable companions lounging by the fire, they were living, purring hot water bottles. But the real MVPs were the larger animals. Some nobles actually invited their livestock inside during winter. Talk about an exclusive indoor party. Studies suggest that a single cow could raise the temperature by 5 to 10 degrees in its immediate surroundings. Medieval nobles basically had their own portable heating system, just with more mooing. Before you wrinkle your nose, they weren't complete savages about it. These four-legged heaters had their own designated areas, usually separated from the main living spaces. The floor would be covered with thick layers of straw, kind of like nature's welcome mat. Servants had the glamorous job of regular cleanup duty, which probably wasn't listed in the perks of the position section. But hey, what's a little animal maintenance when you're getting free heating? The arrangement worked surprisingly well. The animals stayed cozy, the nobles stayed warm, and everyone pretended not to notice the occasional farmyard symphony echoing through the halls. It was the original win-win situation, even if it meant sometimes having to explain to visitors why there was a sheep in the next room attending to its wool-growing duties. On the topic of wool, medieval nobles weren't exactly hitting the catwalk in their winter wardrobes, but they sure knew how to dress for success, if success meant not turning into a human icicle. Their clothing strategy was basically more is more, and they took layering to an entirely new level. Starting from the inside out, they wore linen undergarments. Yes, even nobles had medieval underwear, but unlike our cotton basics, these were specifically designed to trap air close to the body. Next came the woolen tunics and gowns, often made from the finest sheep's wool money could buy. Fun fact, a single noble's winter outfit could use wool from up to 5 sheep. And these weren't your average itchy sweaters. We're talking about garments so well made that some have survived in museums to this day. The real showstoppers were their outer layers. Wealthy nobles draped themselves in furs and velvets that would make any modern fashionista green with envy. Fur-lined cloaks weren't just status symbols, they were basically walking blankets. And when I say fur, I'm not talking about a little trim here and there. These cloaks were often lined with multiple fox or marten furs, creating a toasty microclimate for their privileged wearers. But here's where it gets interesting. Their clothes were actually engineered for warmth. The seamstresses and tailors of the time were like medieval thermal engineers. They designed garments to be fitted at strategic points, creating air pockets that trapped warm air close to the body. It was like having a personal greenhouse effect minus the environmental concerns. Velvet was the medieval equivalent of today's performance fabric. Its thick pile trapped air and provided excellent insulation. A noble wearing a velvet gown lined with fur was essentially walking around in the medieval version of a NASA spacesuit, minus the helmet and with considerably more embroidery. The really clever bit? These outfits were designed to work together with all their other heating methods. Those layers worked perfectly when sitting near a fireplace, didn't get in the way when snuggling into their feather beds, and actually benefited from the ambient heat provided by their indoor animal heating system. The nobles might have looked like overstuffed peacocks, but they were warm, overstuffed peacocks. And let's not forget the accessories. Gloves lined with fur, boots padded with wool, and hoods that would make any modern hoodie jealous. Getting dressed in the morning probably felt like preparing for an Arctic expedition, but at least they looked fabulous while staying warm. Though I have to wonder, how did they manage to eat soup without dipping their fur-lined sleeves into it? When it came to keeping castles warm, medieval builders were absolute geniuses at playing the long game. Those massive stone walls weren't just for keeping out invading armies. They were medieval thermal batteries, built up to 12 feet thick in some places. That's the height of 2 tall men standing on each other's shoulders. These walls did something amazing. They soaked up heat during the day like a stone sponge and released it slowly at night. The stones weren't picked at random either. Builders specifically chose dense stones that could hold heat better than your grandmother holds onto family recipes. During summer days, these walls would warm up under the sun, and by night, they'd radiate that warmth back into the rooms. In winter, they'd capture whatever heat they could from those roaring fireplaces we talked about earlier. Windows? Well, they were more like arrow slits with delusions of grandeur. Medieval nobles weren't big fans of floor-to-ceiling windows, mainly because they hadn't figured out how to make large sheets of glass yet, but also because they knew bigger windows meant bigger heat losses. Their windows were small and strategically placed, usually on the south-facing walls where they could catch the most sunlight. They were like solar panels before solar panels were cool, except instead of generating electricity, they were letting in precious warmth. The builders had another trick up their sleeves. They made these windows slightly angled. The outside opening was smaller than the inside, which meant less cold air could get in, but the sunlight could spread out more once it entered the room. It was like having a medieval spotlight system, except instead of highlighting performers, it was highlighting the fact that medieval architects really knew their stuff. The walls were so thick that people used to joke that even gossip had trouble getting through them, but that thickness meant you could be standing next to a wall during a winter storm and it would feel barely cooler than the rest of the room. Not bad for people who didn't have physics textbooks or thermal imaging cameras. Speaking of keeping things cozy from top to bottom, medieval nobles didn't just stop at the walls. They looked up and thought, hey, what about the roof? Their solution? Thatched roofs that were basically the medieval equivalent of a winter hat for their homes. We're talking thick layers of straw or reed packed so densely you could barely push your finger through it. These weren't your basic grass haircuts for houses either. A properly thatched roof could be up to 2 feet thick, each piece of straw or reed carefully layered and positioned to create thousands of tiny air pockets. These air pockets were the real MVPs of medieval roof insulation. They trapped warm air trying to escape upward and kept cold air from sneaking in, working like nature's bubble wrap. The best part? These roofs were surprisingly smart. In summer, they'd keep the hot air out, and in winter, they'd keep the warm air in. It's like they invented climate control before climate control was even a thing. Plus, when it rained or snowed, the water would roll right off instead of soaking in, proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. And here's a fun fact. A well-made thatched roof could last up to 60 years. That's longer than most modern roofs today. Though I suppose when your other option was freezing during winter, you made sure to do the job right the first time. While those cozy thatched roofs kept the warmth from escaping upward, medieval nobles had another brilliant idea for maximizing every bit of heat they could get. They turned winter into party season. They discovered something that college students in cramped dorms would later reinvent. Body heat is free heating. But unlike today's crowded parties, medieval gatherings were decidedly more sophisticated affairs. Well, most of the time. The great halls of medieval castles would often host gatherings where dozens of people would come together, and not just for the sparkling conversation. Scientists today tell us that a single person generates about the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Now multiply that by 50 or 60 people in a great hall, and you've got yourself a medieval radiator system powered by gossip and wine. These gatherings weren't just random crowdsourced heating events. Nobles would host elaborate feasts that could last for hours. Between the body heat, the roaring fires, and all the hot food being served, these parties could raise the temperature of a great hall by several degrees. Add in some dancing, because nothing warms you up like attempting a medieval jig in 7 layers of wool, and you had yourself a proper heating system. The clever bit was how they organized these gatherings. Important meetings? Schedule them for the coldest part of winter. Big feast? Make it a multi-day affair in January. Suddenly, being a social butterfly wasn't just about maintaining your status. It was about maintaining your body temperature. Musicians would play, storytellers would share tales, and everyone would laugh a bit louder than necessary. More movement equals more heat, after all. The real pros knew that a good argument about politics or the neighbor's new tapestry could warm up a room faster than any fireplace. Medieval nobles were basically running on drama-powered heating. And the best part? Nobody had to feel guilty about lingering too long at these gatherings. After all, they weren't being socially awkward. They were contributing to the communal heating system. It was basically medieval environmental consciousness at its finest. But some nobles weren't content with just body heat and fireplaces. The really fancy ones installed what I like to call the medieval underfloor heating system, the hippocaust. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of modern radiant floor heating, just with more smoke and significantly more manual labor. The system was brilliantly simple. A furnace would heat air that flowed through hollow spaces under the floors and sometimes inside the walls. Imagine walking on warm tiles in the dead of winter. Pretty luxurious for medieval times, right? The heated floors would radiate warmth upward, creating a cozy atmosphere that even those party-loving nobles envied. Of course, maintaining a hippocaust wasn't exactly a walk in the warm park. It required constant attention from servants who had to keep the furnace running and clean out the soot. But for those who could afford it, having warm floors was the ultimate medieval flex, like having heated car seats in a world of wooden benches. Speaking of keeping things toasty from below, while some nobles heated their floors with hippocausts, everyone's favorite heat source came from the castle kitchen. It wasn't just a place to whip up fancy feasts, it was practically a heating plant disguised as a cooking space. Those massive cooking fires did double duty, warming up the castle while preparing meals that could feed a small army or one very hungry noble family. What's clever is how they maximized the heat from cooking. Stews and soups weren't just popular because they were filling. These dishes needed hours of slow cooking, which meant the kitchen fires stayed lit longer. The nobles basically invented the first slow cookers medieval style, and those heated stones used for cooking, they'd get tossed into drinking vessels to warm up wine or ale, creating the world's first heated beverages program. The kitchen was so warm that servants would often sneak in just to thaw out their frozen fingers. Between the constant cooking fires, the hot stones, and all that steam from bubbling pots, the kitchen was like a medieval spa, just with more onions and considerably less aromatherapy. The ways in which medieval upper-class people heated their homes were remarkably creative, combining practicality with available resources. From using animals for warmth to relying on the heat generated by cooking meals, these methods allowed them to stay comfortable during harsh winters. What's even more fascinating is that many of these techniques have endured in some form to this day. Whether it's the comfort of a crackling fire, the insulating properties of thick walls, or the cozy warmth that comes from communal gatherings. Despite the advances in technology, there's something timeless about how medieval people made the best use of what they had, turning necessity into innovation. Their resourcefulness in heating their homes continues to inspire modern solutions that blend history with practicality.